Good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling, CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation journeys. And this is our weekly Tuesday live stream, which we do at the same time every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So thank you for joining here today. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment, but before I do, today's topic is how IT outsourcing can enable digital transformation ROI. So we're going to talk about IT outsourcing in general. What are some of the pros and cons, the cost benefit? Is it right for you? What are the challenges and upsides to be aware of? All that stuff related to IT outsourcing, particularly if you're in the midst of a more formalized or a broader digital transformation. We'll talk about it within that context. We have a global audience here today, so I encourage you to please, if you don't mind, just let us know in the chat where you're joining from today. We'd love to see what city and country you're joining us from here today as we get started in the conversation. So please drop in the chat. We're watching the chats for all the streams or all the channels that we're streaming to. So I appreciate it hearing from where you are today. Also, speaking of the chat, if you have questions along the way, please drop those in the chat at any point as we're getting into the conversation here. I've got a list of questions to get us started, but really this is the audience's session here. So we're going to take questions from the audience throughout the conversation. And also, this recording and this live stream is actually going to become part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which this episode will come out a week from tomorrow. And so you're getting to be part of the live production, if you will. This conversation, this recording will get edited. It'll get sliced up and put into our podcast format, which premieres every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all the audio podcast platforms as well. So thank you for being part of the live production and seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak, with that, with this live conversation. So again, our conversation here today, how IT or outsourcing can enable digital transformation ROI. And we thought, what better person to have on the show than a guest that we've had a couple times now in the past. And that is Brad Feakes, who's the president of a company called Estes Group. So Brad, thanks for being here today.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me, Eric. Good to be back.
Yeah, great to have you again. It's been a while, so it's good to have you here. Maybe to start, just tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll sort of dive into this whole IT outsourcing discussion. Tell us
Sure.
about your role and how you grew up in the space.
Well, first off, you talk about the sausage being made. I got to do a quick tangent here. So I'm in my basement of my house, which was my grandfather-in-law's house. He was the son of a butcher, spent his whole life trying to figure out his father's sausage making recipes. His father had apprenticed as a sausage maker in Germany before coming back over the pond. So I am sitting in the spot where a sausage stuffer used to reside. It's about 300 pounds, cast iron. I had to pull the damn thing up the stairs and almost tore my biceps. So when you talk about the sausage being made, that's a term near and dear to my heart. I'm not the biggest sausage eater, but I've had to apprentice under him a couple of times. Anyways, we won't go too deep into that subject. But yes, Brad Feakes, Estes Group. So Estes Group is a company that is a managed IT and cloud provider, in addition to doing ERP services. So we're a company that kind of went laterally shifted from managed or implementing ERP systems functionally as a system integrator, and moved to much more ERP managed services. So hosting the ERP applications and then providing auxiliary services on top of that. We found over the years that our customers were asking us more and more, not just for how to configure the system, but how to maintain the system and all of its auxiliaries as that system deploys and branches out.
Great. Yeah, and I just have to say this too. You're probably the one person I know where I could talk about any sort of analogy or random fact, and you will have another random fact or analogy to tie it all together. So that's awesome that I just happened to mention sausage production, and you have a story about where you're sitting right now, where that is.
Yeah,
But
we could ramble. We could definitely ramble. You want to talk about Marvel comic book heroes and movies and such? We could go down a lot of rabbit holes, but I'll try to keep us on track. At least myself.
that's a great. You just gave me an idea for a potential topic in the future. Maybe Marvel, the connection between Marvel superheroes and digital transformation or cloud.
Perfect.
I don't know.
Well, maybe we can dress up for Halloween. I'm a Thor guy. I loved the hair envy, Chris Hemsworth hair envy, among other things. But anyways,
Right. Right. But we digress, of course. And I'm sure there'll be more digressions in this conversation based on past ones you and I have had. So I guess just to start, if you look back, going back to the 90s, it seems like organizations have sort of ebb and flowed in their appetite for outsourcing in general. You see these trends kind of come and go where organizations are starting to try to outsource back office functions like accounts payable or certain finance and accounting functions. Certainly, IT is one of them. But I feel like IT is one area of business in general that over the last 5 to 10 years has really been, the pendulum has been swinging pretty aggressively toward outsourcing, with managed services, with cloud solutions, and organizations seem to be, in general, not all of them, but in general, organizations are looking for ways to sort of push that IT function out to others that can manage it better than they can. Maybe not all the functions, but certain ones. So I guess just to start, why do you think this IT outsourcing trend is such a real thing, and why is it so important during digital transformations in general?
Oh boy. So I would say there's one kind of continuing factor. So I grew up, entered the in the 90s, and at the time we were doing a lot of Six Sigma and Lean Sigma activities, and some of that had to do with the idea of what we called core competencies at the time, that we wanted a business to focus on what they were really good at doing and finding ways to outsource things that weren't core to their business. I had many companies say, we're not a software house, we are a manufacturer of X. So our core competency shouldn't be software development, or it shouldn't be managed IT. It shouldn't be addressing the infrastructure of the system that keeps us up. Now, every customer has kind of a different dividing line in terms of the things that they see as core and the things as they see as auxiliary, because quite often, what is it? Marshall McLuhan, the median is the message. So at some point, the underlying infrastructure becomes part of the delivery of the product or service, and at some point it becomes ancillary. So a lot of companies are trying to figure out those core pieces are versus those auxiliaries. So I think that trend continues, that there are always folks who are trying to figure out, I don't want to worry about the server closet. I want to worry about making and selling and distributing goods. So that's one piece. Another, I would say, is less strategic and more pragmatic. I run into a lot of customers who are losing their IT staff over time through just normal attrition, retirement, illness. The COVID pandemic changed all kinds of things about what people want to do. I know IT network administrators who decided that, I'm going to take this PPP money and I'm going to go make furniture for a living. And suddenly you don't have those network admins anymore because they're off making tables and chairs. Other cases, you have simple health issues. We've had people who've come to us frequently with our system administrators retiring, and we don't have a person in the region that can fill that void. Two, honestly, deaths have been an issue where people abruptly lose members of their company and have to very quickly ramp up someone else to come in there. And when they get that option, it's either you go down the hiring path and you try to find that body, or you try to find someone who's a partner with you that can add those services immediately and figure out a way to add the appropriate number of services. So I would say, in terms of macroeconomic and strategic, there's a lot of things that are driving folks in this direction.
Do you see certain types of organizations that are more open to outsourcing? Like, for example, you talked about people dying and maybe people that have been highly tenured within an organization. They have all this tribal knowledge. Are those more mature, more established organizations any more or less likely to move to an IT outsourcing model than, say, a small or high growth company?
I would say it might sometimes betray what your assumption would be going in. A well-established company might actually be a late adopter to managed services because they've already built a solid architecture, infrastructure, which includes a hiring structure for getting people in and replacing them. And those might be the most hesitant to brush that off. So I see companies that are in the $200 million range tend to have a pretty good infrastructure set up, and they tend to be as interested. Now, companies that are in that range between 20 and seem to be a sweet spot of folks who are sensitive to sudden losses of employees, and also very interested in trying to figure out ways to cut headcount and focus their headcount in certain directions. Also, I think there's probably another trend that we're seeing, and you guys have actually been talking about this. We've been having some banter over LinkedIn in terms of the reconfiguration of IT departments to focus more on strategic initiatives and going back to core competencies in some ways is that IT is still a core competency, but they should be focused on the business matters much more than the technical matters. The technical matters are things that are relatively commoditized, such that they can be handled by one of many people, and the areas where the business, where IT can really have an impact, end up being much more things that are customer and supplier focused, end user capabilities, providing things that are differentiators to that company within their own market.
That's a great point. So you're saying then that organizations are taking kind of bifurcating their IT functions, are taking the strategic stuff and then the more commoditized type stuff. And it's
Mhm.
more the commoditized type stuff that they're moving or more likely to move to an outsource model.
I think, yeah, the commoditization is definitely one big factor. The other is mission criticality. So you might have a commoditized service like, say, network switches, and you have resources who can handle that. And you might have also server management. So the network is the thing that that your internal team needs in order to be to communicate kind of laterally across the organization. This becomes really important if you're adding multiple branches. We see that in distribution a lot, where distributors will have 10 branches. They'll have like 5 people in a branch, and they need to be communicating really rapidly across that branch. So those IT staff that you have now, they're mobilized to attack those issues because those become mission critical, whereas the server is just kind of sitting there. And those are things that are then easier to hand off. Now, some companies might take that same approach and look to outsource or use managed services to handle both the network and the back end server architecture. All depends kind of then what that line that I was talking about in terms of what is mission critical, what is auxiliary.
Right, right. That's great. Well, maybe to break down IT outsourcing a bit, maybe tell us the major components. I mean, certainly managed services and cloud are sort of the two main things I think of when I think of IT outsourcing, but maybe help us understand what are the major components and how do they differ from one another
Right.
within the outsourcing model?
So I tend to treat cloud as a managed service. I tend to say that folks are using and consuming managed services even when they don't realize it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I use the managed services, anything that back in 1990 a company would have had to manage on their own. So if you were using Goldmine in 1990 as your CRM, you were installing it, hosting it locally, providing users access. Now you're using Salesforce, and that Salesforce application is a SaaS based, so it still is deployed to a server somewhere. There's still all of that business logic, the database, the application server, et cetera. All those things are managed. You're now just consuming the application in a SaaS model. Really, it's the management of all of that server's backend is still being done by someone, and you're still paying for it, but you're paying for it through that subscription. So cloud's certainly one big facet there. And of course, we could divide the cloud into all kinds of subsets depending on the types of services that are rendered, et cetera. I think security is, of course, one big area. That would be like perimeter edge security around your network's edge, or internal security, or what we used to call antivirus. Now I think they call it endpoint. Sounds much more clever. So security is as a service is certainly one big area. Backup and disaster recovery. So DRAS is a big deal for customers because in our ransomware age, the ability to roll back to a stable version of your network in the event of a disaster like ransomware becomes a big piece. So that's one area. Um, Help desk. So you have a lot of folks who are looking for help desk assistance, so that instead of calling up Bill down the hall, now they have a whole group of people that they can reach out to in the event that their computer bombs out on them. And so that outsourced IT might actually be a out insource. So I've seen folks who are looking for footprint resources who are, they don't own them or have to employ them, they subscribe to them, but they are located locally at a customer's site, so that they can provide that face-to-face interaction. I would say, even in terms of we have customers in the ERP front who are now coming to us looking for ERP based subscription services. So it's more application layer support, things that a support analyst in a large company would be providing, someone who has knowledge of your ERP system and how it should be used, and when issues come up, can troubleshoot those. Folks are looking for that service now, either even to be something that they consume without having to have an actual physical person that they employ to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, are you seeing much? resistance to moving to that model? Because that what you just described is fairly disruptive, right? It's just totally different than how organizations were viewing and managing their IT functions 10 or 20 years ago. And I remember 10 or 20 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago is a more accurate time frame, but I do remember about 10 years ago, it felt like a lot of CIOs and IT types were still pretty skeptical of the cloud and sort of pushing back on the loss of control and the fact that they don't have the server sitting in their back, IT room, back in their server room. It just felt like they didn't have the same control or visibility. On more the human adoption side, are you still seeing that or signs of resistance from organizations where it's sort of a threat to their jobs or their security or whatever the case may be?
I definitely, and I think a lot of it still is justified. As a person who is both a provider and a consumer of IT services, I understand the level of service that I can get internally by hiring a person to help me with the things that I need. And if I'm not getting that same level of service from a provider, I'm going to be hesitant. I'm going to be resistant. That service can exist as a network admin. It can have to do with the differences between SaaS-based software versus a more on-premise or private cloud in terms of are the services that I'm getting worth the amount of investment that I'm putting in, and am I losing things in the transition? So there's a lot of definite, I would say, general tire kicking probably is the right term to understand, is this service truly going to give me what I need, and am I not going to lose things in making that transition? Now, some of it also might have to do with um, people fearing loss of control and or loss of employment. Those tend to be challenges. Now, in a lot of cases where we're replacing people who've left, that there's a gap to fill, and so filling that gap naturally, you circumvent a lot of the change management challenges because they are in need of those services. So they're much more willing to bring someone in. Now, when you have existing infrastructure and existing people, working out that relationship becomes a big challenge. And for us, there's certainly some challenges there to figuring out what the right line is for every customer.
Right, right. Yeah, makes total sense. And I'll be curious to see over time, how that change curve or that change adoption, openness or willingness sort of evolves over time as people get more used to this whole cloud and managed service model. I want to turn to the audience real quick. We first of all, it looks like our LinkedIn feed might be down, so we are still streaming to the other places. But thank you for the heads up that the LinkedIn stream is questionable at best. But in the meantime, we had some great participation or some people joining from all over the world. Srinivas from Singapore, Bruno from Houston, Texas, Corneliu from Romania. It looks like Hassan's on here as well from Saudi Arabia, and others in the room as well. So thanks for joining thanks for letting us know where you're joining from today. And here's a interesting comment from Gassan over on LinkedIn before the LinkedIn feed went down. But he says he pulled over at a drive-thru at Wendy's to order a meal. The guy who took my order, Mike, who spoke in an American accent, was in fact Rajesh from India, and this was back in 1983. So it's not really a question tied to this, but it's sort of a reminder that this outsourcing model is really nothing new. I mean, it's something we've been experimenting with as a global society, I suppose, for the last 30 to 40 years for sure. And it seems like now it's just picking up steam, and now you're starting to see some real, use cases and more mainstream adoption of some of these models, especially in the world of IT, like we're talking here today. What are some of the pros and cons or cost benefit of migrating to an outsourced model, whether it's cloud/managed services or any other sort of outsourcing within IT?
So, in terms of costs in general, costs are quite often relative to the people in question and the services that are being rendered. What often I see is if you're going to employ an employee full time and you're going to expect a managed service provider to provide all of those sets of services that the employee provided, your costs might end up being pretty much a wash, or you might end up paying more for a managed service just because you're paying for redundancy, 24-hour service, etc. The What you're trying to get when you work with a managed IT provider is to avoid what you might call that single point of contact, and that bottleneck of a specific role or individual who's doing all the things. And in order to be able to achieve those, they have to extend themselves significantly over weekends, evenings, doing server backups and restorations, updates. All those things require a lot out of an individual person. That often in smaller organizations turns that person into kind of a bottleneck. So if they're suddenly not there, if they're on vacation, the whole machine comes to a grinding halt. So those are one of the benefits that you come to when you work with a managed service provider. Another would be is that MSPs generally can take that technology that they develop for one situation and then extend that over other situations. So if you have monitoring agents that are looking for file backups or failed processes running, you don't need an individual out there on the weekend making sure that MRP completed over the weekend. Rather, you can have tools that do that for you, and then manage by exception. Managed service providers get efficient by managing by exception and having building tool sets and leveraging tool sets that exist that do that work for you. So I think that's one of the keys, is that if you're coming to a managed service and you're looking for benefits, it should come from a provider that can lay out some of those tools and say, these are the things we do that would prevent human work. I had one IT director that I used to work with, and he said they always try to automate the mundane. Right. So if there's something that's a repeatable process, it's a mundane process, it's not something that requires a huge amount of intellectual capital. That's something where you should be using RPA or BPR, one of those other great acronyms, to try and make that thing happen automatically without the need for human intervention. I think that's where MSPs can add some value, because if they're adding human intervention on the things that are really mission critical and really do require some experience and background, et cetera, by automating all the mundane, they give themselves more time to jump in on the big hitting things when they do arise.
Yeah, yeah, allows you to stay a little more focused on the higher value, higher criticality type stuff.
Exactly.
So here's, speaking of cost benefit, pros and cons, here's a question from Third Stage Consulting, posted over on YouTube. How do you protect your IP, your intellectual property, when it comes to outsourcing? What should be included in the SOW? And maybe we could just talk for a moment more broadly, even beyond that. Who does own who owns the IP, and who owns the data, who owns the software, and then the second part of that is what they're asking here, which is, how do you protect that IP when you're outsourcing?
Mm-hmm. So I think so two questions. Let's start with the idea of ownership. Generally, I approach it in terms of what we're providing, the services that we're providing, the tool sets that we provide. Those are the things that are the domain of the MSP or the services provider. The environment in which that occurs, that's kind of an open question sometimes, especially if you're delving into cloud. If you're managing your server, the ecosystem of your customer, and they own that physical ecosystem then there's a very clear line of delineation that says, okay, this is where the line is drawn. You are managing our physical environment. Now, when that becomes virtualized, that gets to be a little more difficult. So quite often the licensing might be something that is part of the service offered. So the licensing might actually be owned by the managed service provider. In terms of the actual IP, when you get into that case, pretty much that is all part of the customer's proprietary rights. And those are things that a managed service provider needs to be very careful, both to have clear understanding as to this is how deep we go into the data, and this is where we stay out, and also this is the levels of ownership that exist, and if we were ever to terminate a relationship, this is how we would go about our way of disseminating and bringing back what is properly owned by that customer. Now, I think a lot of that also has to do with the jurisdiction that you're working within, and kind of the legal underpinnings. If you're like an ITAR compliant or a CMMC, if you're working in like Department of Defense or what have you, they have very strict standards about what you have to follow, both as a company, and then any of your vendors, any of your service providers need to be doing that as well. So we just went through SOC 2 certification, which is one of those certifications that are out there that helps ensure that we're doing all the right things to make sure that our business practices are not compromising our customers by kind of transitive property. You're trying to avoid that. So if you're looking at a managed service provider, you want to make sure, are they compliant in all the areas where you'd need them to be compliant in order to support your own business processing. We have several customers where our compliance is absolutely mandated for them to be able to do what they're doing. So if you're in a DoD situation, you're probably not going to be able to use public cloud, right? Public cloud, the lines of delineation between companies are too paper thin. You need to be in a environment, a government cloud, which is normally some form of private cloud with some pretty heavy firewalls and air gapping and all that good stuff. But you want to make sure that your providers capabilities in terms of compliance match what your needs are as a business.
Yeah, yeah. And are there anything in terms of, I guess a follow up to that would be anything in terms of cybersecurity? Sometimes people will ask us as consultants, is my stuff, is my data and all my competitive information, is it safe in the cloud, knowing that I don't own it anymore, or I don't physically own it or possess it on my four walls of my office, and now it's in the cloud. Someone else is doing the managed service model. How do you handle cybersecurity, and how does that compare to what an internal mom and pop IT department might be able to do?
There's some definite concerns there, and I think that's one of the biggest pushbacks of SaaS software that I've seen is the lack of access and control to the data layer, except as mitigated through the application layer. And I find a lot of customers get very nervous about that, and I've seen because we've transitioned several customers from a SaaS-based system into more of a private cloud, and actually the act of getting your data back is something that's difficult. Vendors make it hard for you to decouple from them. So the act of getting your database is actually a several day process. Not that it takes that long, just in terms of it tends to be a low priority item for them, and getting that data back can be a little nerve wracking because it's of course that's business central to everything you're doing. So I think that's a for us it ends up being how safe something is has to do with how secure the provider is. If you're working in a public cloud, you can expect that that level of safety is lower, which is why government mandates tighter restrictions. So the question is, if it's not good enough for the Department of Defense, is it good enough for your company? That's something you should always be asking. So as a and this was interesting. We had just done a webinar last week or the week before on a data center and kind of some of the considerations to go through in terms of choosing a data center, because your cloud environment's only as safe as the data center in which it's hosting. If you find out that your service provider has a data center in a hurricane zone, you can imagine now if you're a company in Florida and a local data center, and there's a barrier wall breaking and a swell coming in. We've had customers come to us out of Louisiana because their server room was literally underwater. Um, so the
Wow.
location of a data center, it becomes one huge factor. So even your concept with cybersecurity, I start with physical security, all the basics. Is it surrounded by a big thick wall with barbed wire? Does it have redundant power? Does it have X number of gallons of diesel fuel so it can run those generators? How many barriers is from the internal to the external? I see normally three barriers is the key. You have an outside brick wall, you have a first panel brick wall, and then once you get primary access, now you have a secondary wall inside where the actual data center is hosted, and you have something like eyeball security to get through so that you can really limit the number of people who have access. And then once you get into there, you now have secondary cages and stuff, and some of those certifications and such are about that physical security. So you really want to ask yourself, both physically and in terms of cybersecurity, how secure is your provider making that data? Because if a data provider can't secure your data, either physically or in terms of cyber, you're really putting yourself in a challenge. And we have customers who come to us because their MSP had gotten ransomed. So that was one case that we had just recently where their own MSP, their managed service provider, had gotten ransomed. It took them a week to get their data back. So we had to take their data, scrub the living daylights out of it to make sure that nothing was still persisting, and then stand it up in a new environment. So that's a legitimate risk and something that you definitely want to be critiquing when you make decisions. I know you guys do software selection. I think there's a certain amount of everything needs some kind of selection process where you are running something through the gauntlet of questions and confirmations to make sure that what you have meets your needs. And you want to always avoid taking things for granted when it comes to outsourcing.
Yeah. And I know you guys at Estes, you focus on not just managed services and cloud in general, but you also help clients deploy different types of enterprise applications. And
Mhm.
when you're doing that, some of those software vendors that you guys work with or that you help deploy on the technical side are offering either private cloud and or public cloud solutions, from what I understand, as far as the vendors you're working with. So I guess sort of shifting to a question related to that, from over on YouTube. When it comes to private cloud, what type of businesses should focus on a private cloud solution versus a public cloud? Like, how would I know if I'm a business which one's best for me, or what my options really are?
Mhm. Oh boy, so that becomes a question that has a bunch of different threads. Let's hit a couple of the big ones here. So one has to do with configurability versus customizability. So the degree to which the complexity of your business requirements inside of your organization, the degree to which that affects your need to tailor your ERP can affect whether or not you go down a private or a public route. Because a public cloud SaaS-based system is configurable without being nearly as customizable. And because of that, you find yourself with a limited set of things that you can do to that application to get it to perform the way it needs to support your core competencies, your differentiators. If those differentiators require a greater degree of tailoring, then you're probably better in a private cloud, because a private cloud gives you a degree of access and control that the public doesn't happen. And quite often, ERP vendors, bless their hearts, tend to say that, oh, it's all the same, when in truth the private cloud or the on-premise licensure of the system offers capabilities and functionalities that their public cloud version doesn't. And I mean, you guys have chronicled this long and hard as companies try to migrate on-premise systems into the cloud. Those challenges of getting all that functionality that was built using one very specific paradigm to now function within a very different paradigm, there are some growing pains there, and I see customers still feeling a fair bit of that. So the functionality gap is one piece there. I would say complexity now comes to another level when you talk about integrations. All right, so if you're playing IT buzzwords, I'm going to hit in one right in the center. Hybrid cloud, one of those great terms, right up there with digital transformation. It's one of those drinking games. If we played the digital transformation drinking game, we'd be under the table by now. But so hybrid
We
clouds end up being where you integrate your core application with all these ancillary applications to provide auxiliary functionality. This might be e-commerce, this might be CRM, this might be quality management, engineering, and these things need to connect with your application. So anything that connects with your application is a potential security risk. So you need to be careful to understand how is that connection occurring and what kind of system is required to support that connection. Because some systems work only at that kind of web API layer. REST is probably our most famous acronym right now. A lot of vendors struggle with a REST API that can handle full functionality. So quite often you find requiring a third party to live at the application or database server levels to be able to provide that integrated functionality. That is not possible in a SaaS-based system, a private or a public cloud system where everything is arm's length from your application. So for companies that need that level of integration up and down the stack, you end up finding yourself needing to go down a private cloud option. I had one customer who did just that. They moved from an on-premise into a pure SaaS, and then realized that every integration line that they had built needed to be radically reconstructed in order to make it SaaS ready. So they ended up spending what was supposed to be a 2 month. They were promised a 2 month conversion. It ended up being 9 months. So that extra 7 months was all figuring out how all those integrations would work and turning those into kind of API level integration. So basically, they ended up having a baby in 9 months for what they thought would be a much shorter putt in terms of a migration. I'm comparing
Right.
golf and childbirth. I apologize. Those are some strange metaphors.
Yeah, and we already covered sausage making. I mean, there's a lot of metaphors we're we're jumping to here. Well, what about in the cloud, in a cloud environment? How does it work with like integration between applications, or putting in on top of it a business intelligence or analytical tool layer? Leveraging that big data to get better analytics and insights, or just basic integration of systems. I mean, how does that sort of that traditional way of thinking about systems of integration and the reporting, the business intelligence, all that stuff? How does that differ in the cloud, or does it differ in the cloud versus an on-prem sort of a solution?
I would say in a cloud, the best thing is you have kind of that cloud layer of cloud firewall that allows for a much more specific allowance of what goes in and what goes out. When we migrate from an on private cloud, we see sometimes their firewalls have been in the past. How many potential abilities are there? So when we spin up a cloud, by default, all ports are closed as needed. And when you open a port in order to allow migration to come out, you're working with a vendor to understand, okay, these are the IP lists and these are the ones that we will not whitelist. Should this, be getting communication from Bangladesh? If not, okay, we turn that off. You can govern that, I think, better in a cloud environment than you can in a lower level. Outside of that, I think the cloud raises opportunities for merging of data in ways that are much more expansive than on-premise, just because of scalability. Really, one of the best things about cloud is the idea of scalability, so that if you need extra bandwidth, extra memory storage, et cetera, you're not going and buying hardware and configuring it. You're just turning some dials in terms of what size your VMs need to be and how those things need to communicate to each other. And then when you build a server architecture in the cloud now, because it's all inside the cloud network, the communication internally can be much more trustworthy, because it's not an edge integration, it's more internal to that. So I think there's a lot of what I see a lot of our customers are taking. The cloud has become the stepping stone to things like business intelligence and better visualizing, cubing, taking your data and turning it into valuable information. The cloud was kind of that first step to getting there. So that's, I think, one of the biggest benefits that I see folks getting as an auxiliary benefit of some of these decisions.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. And here's a kind of a follow up comment from Gassan over on YouTube that I wanted to get your feedback on, Brad. And that is, once data is in the cloud, it isn't private unless digital data supply chain flow is encrypted, the data in motion and when at rest. But then again, that's debatable. So I guess maybe it's just a broader. Maybe I'll kind of rephrase the question here of, is data really private if you have a private cloud established for your applications, and if so, how do you protect it, or what are some of the protocols that are in place to help protect that data?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's any time that data is leaving your internal network, yes, it's no longer private. I think that's a legitimate challenge. Anytime you communicate outside of your network. And so if you are truly looking for the most private of private clouds, that private cloud is truly an on-premise server architecture that's been spun up into VMs. And so now you have a private cloud. I think the key there is what we call air gapping, in terms of when you set up systems, you're configuring them in such a way that they're not sharing any resources. That's kind of one key place where you can keep some of that security natural inherent inside of a private cloud. The other would be using virtual firewalls versus physical firewalls. Having, even at the data center level, there is some degree of physical appliance-based barriers that are helping prevent transmigration of data. Of course, yeah, you mentioned encryption. Challenge with encryption is security versus performance, and the time and invested to try to couple and recouple that data. So I would say there are legitimate challenges that people feel in terms of the security of their data once it's left their system. The key, I think, ends up being at that data center provider and all the layers above that. What are they doing to try to make sure that that data is no longer there's a few chances or many barriers to making that data public as possible. And that goes back to we're talking about physical security, but also network security, and even when the data is now left your data center, how is that being communicated? One of our providers has their whole system, all their redundant databases are connected with proprietary fiber, so they're not utilizing anybody else's services to make those interconnections. So if you need you have a primary data center is on a eastern power grid, and your secondary backup is on a central power grid. The eastern power grid goes off. Now you need to switch over to your backup, to your hot site. Is that interchange of data something that's being mitigated by AT&T, or is it something that the data center provider themselves have? That becomes one of those areas where the more that you own of that network, the less the risk tends to be.
Yeah, makes total sense. Now, here's a potentially triggering question that might create a little controversy, which is why I love the question. and leave it to Third Stage Consulting and our team at Third Stage to be the ones to ask it over on YouTube. But this is true or false, Eric and Brad. Cloud solutions are more expensive than on-prem solutions. Let the debate begin.
I would say, well, I mean, I would start with yes. I would say that if you are looking to do an on-premise solution with your own team members, you can buy hardware, buy software, employ FTEs for a lower cost than you can have a third-party provider do that. I would say that that's a fair statement. I'm not going to fight that statement. Now, if you go and kind of broaden total cost of ownership, okay, that becomes your next question. Do you increase your risk factor by doing it that way? If your risk, of course, can be permeability to digital threats, loss of people and attrition. All those things we've talked about there are things that increase the cost of ownership. Scalability. Do you have the ability to scale down costs if you have a slowdown in business, or scale up costs, or scale up resources if you need extra resources due to growth without a big effort to try now and get those costs, because that incurs more now that the effort it requires to scale up a business is cost incurred. One of the things that cloud provides, and we have certain customers who have seasonal businesses, so they're like, I need these resources during the peak season, I need less during the slow season. Can you dial that up and down? Yes, we can. So we write that into some of our contracts so that as things come down, you get fewer resources. As things go up, you get higher. Those are, of course, things that so I would say that if you're looking for just simple budgetary numbers, you're probably going to beat that. Now, it all depends too on some of the things that what the vendors themselves are providing and the customer that you're working with. We found what's the other thing in the technical service? I got people always chasing me with Moore's law, right? The idea that the capacity of circuits is improving at this rate such that costs should be reducing. And yes, that you see that working in practice. That the cost of cloud right now is considerably lower than it was 5 years ago. And you see customers are on like a 3 to 5 server replacement cycle. So every 5 years, we'll have a conversation with a customer. Is it time to replace those servers now with the cloud? And we've had a lot of surprise from folks in terms of, oh, well, 5 years ago it was this much, now it's this much. And that those numbers continue to decline. So I say the costs are getting closer and closer in check, and making the cost reason to not go in one direction less and less strong for a lot of people, based on the auxiliary benefits that we've talked about.
Yeah, and it seems like a big part of this, just the pure financial side of it too, is you're shifting the balance sheet, or you're shifting cost from being a capitalized or depreciated cost that's an asset that gets depreciated over time, versus now that's the on-prem model. But now with cloud, you're shifting those assets off the balance sheet, and now you just have an ongoing operating expense. So from a CFO perspective, that could be good or bad depending on what you're trying to accomplish financially. Which is why Kyler made the comment over on YouTube. She was surprised that we didn't just come out and say it depends, which I think is kind of what you're saying, is it does depend on, on kind of what you consider as part of the cost of the real total cost of ownership, as you mentioned, of cloud versus on-prem. You have to take all that stuff into account, short-term, long-term, the tangible, the intangible benefits. One thing I wanted to ask you, though, is as you were talking about it, though, and as we've been talking about, ownership of data and where it resides, and ownership of application, things like that. In recent years, as you know, a lot of bigger vendors, like especially the two that come to mind, are SAP and Microsoft. SAP and Microsoft have sort of drawn a line in the sand and said, guess what, customers that are using on-premise systems, you have to be off those systems by 2025 or 27 or whatever date that ends up slipping to. And so it's sort of creating a sense of panic in the industry of like, oh, wow, this system I've been using for 20 years, now they're not going to support it in 3 years from now, so we better do something. Mm-hmm. And it in some ways, it reminds me of extortion because you're sort of forcing an organization to sort of completely revamp their systems that are running their business. But I guess fast forwarding, 10 years from now, let's say, all these companies move to the cloud, the data, the applications, everything's hosted somewhere else. Are organizations losing a certain amount of leverage, or are they even more beholden to the whims of software vendors and cloud providers, because now they not only are they providing the software, but they are hosting the software, the data, the workflows, the functionality, all that stuff now is hosted by a vendor in the cloud. So I guess, does it create an unfair, unlevel playing field for organizations now?
I think that's definitely a risk. I would say I, I kind of differentiate, say, Microsoft on one end and say SAP on the other, just because when I see Microsoft, they've in general made the transition pretty solid in terms of using, say, 365 to replace Outlook servers and such, so that you're not doing those same old models, and the fact that hosting local email servers has become something that was routinely such a pain in the butt to do, that the migration in many ways wasn't as hard. Plus the fact that they've still provided kind of desktop application support that provides similar look and feel for the end users. I think no one that I know enjoys working in a web version of Microsoft Word versus the on-premise desktop application. Now, if they can get the back end to be such that it's syncing up and saving for you and all that good stuff, now that's just great, because now you've increased your functionality, because now you can access that same document from anywhere and transmit those and share them easier than ever before. So I think those things end up being helpful. So if a vendor is actually helping the customer and making them more productive in the process, it's a lot easier to sell. In the enterprise system, I feel that being a little harder to squeeze, where the systems being offered aren't necessarily comparable to the systems they're replacing, and I see for customers that can be a real frustration. The other thing that I think is really kind of a bit of a field leveler in this industry is the degree to which integrations are becoming more and more a thing that is commonplace. You have so many tools that focus specifically on suite to suite integrations, the ability to pass data over here to over there, which I think allows for a lot of upstarts to come in and try to compete against some of the bigger players, such that if these bigger players overplay their hand, they'll find themselves with a significant amount of competition that is ready to offset that. So when I was 10 years ago, Microsoft Project was the de facto project management tool. Now you have 16,000 project management tools, smart sheets, and this and that, and now even Microsoft is using Teams as a shareware tool to try to do project support. I think it's very quickly happening that customers or competing vendors, entrepreneurs will find a hole in the market where someone is overplaying their hand and look to fill that void by providing a more robust solution with better service. So I think that tends to level the playing field often. Maybe if not in the immediate sense, in the medium term.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had never thought of that. And I guess if you look at history and what some of the recurring trends in history in our space are, you would have, for example, you have 20 years ago when Salesforce and Workday first sort of burst onto the scene, they were really doing what you said, which is sort of attacking the vulnerabilities of these larger, tier one ERP software providers. So they come in and say, we're not going to try and be everything to everyone like SAP. What we're going to do is we're going to create a really good CRM or a really good human capital management system that really chips away at a weakness in those big systems. So I think you're right. I think with the rate at which technology changes and incumbents come and go, and the technological landscape shifts, I think you're right. It makes a lot of sense that you would have upstart competitors that come in and really, as you say, look at where vendors are overplaying their hand and provide a better solution, a lower cost solution, or whatever the case may be for customers. I think the hard part now is we don't know who those people are.
Right.
Who's going to be the one to do that, or to give us something that's a little bit more reasonable. It kind of leads me to a comment here. Another comment from Gassan on YouTube says, these tier one providers are hijacking us by setting their rules, and I ain't paying the ransomware. And I think that's something that organizations should just be aware of, because it may not be ransomware per se, but I think there could be a day in the future where if organizations do overplay their hand, or if software vendors overplay their hand, organizations could be in a position where I have to do what they want. All my data and applications are in the cloud. The switching costs are really high now. It's a lot harder now for me to pull everything out of their cloud solution and go to another cloud solution. And so they can do anything from raise prices, the subscription fees, to other means that really you don't have a lot of leverage. So I think I look forward to seeing who those upstart providers are that might be able to help out with that. It kind of leads me to a question then that's sort of a softball for you, Brad, here, I think, from Kyler. And speaking of vendors, is there a vendor that does cloud services really well? And so, in other words, are there, maybe not just doing it well, but that are good options for organizations that maybe you're skeptical of cloud, or they're not quite sure if they want to move to the cloud, or maybe they don't want to deal with a really big, oversized tech companies that are providing some of these solutions? What are some of the other examples or options that are out there?
Right. So when we talked about tier one, my brain immediately went. I equate when it comes to cloud tier one and big three. So you talk about the big three, Amazon, Google, and Azure as kind of the big dinosaurs in the field, kind of stomping around, and yeah, very hard to work with in many ways because they have tiered pricing structures and complexity factors and egress and ingress fees and such things that make them very difficult to work with. Underneath that, I see a fair bit of upstarts who at a middle tier of service that have breadth and depth necessary in terms of data centers that are located as part of a farm, and they exist on power grids that are disconnected for redundancy purposes. And they offer all the things that the big three offer, but they have a much more flexible and engaging work model so that you can consume resources in much more flexible ways. And they have technical staff that are much more engaged and are earning your business. We found that's why we ended up partnering with one of those firms, a company called US Signal, because we liked the way they did business much more than any of the big three providers. And we haven't found that to be a barrier to entry with pretty much anyone. Is the sheen that comes working with Amazon Web Services or what have you just doesn't seem to be there anymore. A lot of customers are much more skeptical of some of those big players just because of outages, challenges. I know some people said to us after I watched Amazon's The Rings of Power, I knew I was never going to use AWS. I don't know how those two things are correlated. I'll take it though. I'm more of a Peter Jackson man myself, but I would say that certainly is that there's a layer of providers at that next tier who are providing comparable services with much better service levels that are worth exploring.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of your business model at Estes, right? Is to really play in that mid market and provide another option other than the really big providers. Although U.S. Signal is not a small company by any means.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, sure. Oh, time for the shameless company plug, right? So Estes Group, for us, we're a cloud provider in that tertiary manner is that we're carving up resources of others and presenting them to the customer. We're serving that kind of middle layer to folks who don't have the technical chops to go out and carve out those resources themselves. They work with an intermediary like us. So we take those, carve them up according to the resource needs of a customer and offer kind of tailored cloud solutions. And I think for us, for our customers, I think that gives them a nice point of contact. And because we have kind of the business side in addition to the technology, we can treat their technology as a strategic business investment and not just blinking lights.
right, absolutely. So as we're coming up on time here, which has been a great conversation, it's flying by because I didn't get through most of the questions I had for you. But we had a lot of great alternate questions here. But what, in general, if I'm an organization that's thinking about getting started on this whole cloud or outsourcing, IT outsourcing journey, how do I get started? I mean, where do I begin the journey?
So the idea of dipping your toes in the cloud for me is often kind of delineating internally what are some things that aren't mission critical right now, but would be nice to haves, and trying to figure out if the nice to haves work well. I think backup and disaster recovery is a natural area to do that. If you have on site backups and you'd like to move to an off site backup, that's a great way of trying to enter like the DRAS field and have that as kind of one of your first steps into a broader cloud solution. And you start to carve out what some of those look like. Is endpoint security as a service something that would be better managed outside than inside? I would start with some of those things. If I was just trying to see kind of how does this business model work, and does it work well for us? Does the idea, as you'd mentioned, capex versus opex, financial accounting, start to see how that hits the general ledger and whether that hits in a way that you'll like? I would say start with some of those easy handoffs that are the most on the far end of things that are outsourceable. And I normally see endpoint and DRAS as some of those things. And then kind of work your way inward to see from there, is there another place that you would like to go?
Yeah. So in other words, you don't need to go all in on the
No.
cloud all at once, one big bang, rip the band-aid off sort of thing. You can kind of ease
Yeah,
into it.
Yeah, this kind of digital transformation can definitely be incremental in nature, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of proposition. And it isn't for, I would say, any customer that we have. They're all at some place on that the number line in terms of how far they've gone. I think that's a good thing for someone to understand, that you don't have to be giving away the farm in order to take this on.
Right. Right. Great. Well, what are the best ways for people to get a hold of you if they have more questions about cloud or managed services or outsourcing type stuff? What's the best way to reach you and learn more about you and Estes Group?
If you want to come learn more about Estes, I see your folks have been putting our URL up there. So estesgrp.com, great place to start to kind of learn about what we do and what we offer. And we do a fair bit of education. We try to, in terms of cloud in general. So if you're looking just to try to understand the landscape a little better, we have a fair bit of webinars and such we've done on YouTube that you could check out as well. Just see some of the things there, and we can have some conversations.
Great. Well, thanks very much for being here, Brad. Really appreciate it. Great to have you again. Another great conversation, and I feel like there's a lot we didn't cover, but we got it. We started to scratch the surface here and get some better understanding of cloud managed services. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the audience for being here today. Again, these live streams we do every Tuesday, same time, same place. This episode or this interview will become part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow, which is, I believe that's Wednesday the 12th, if I'm remembering correctly. So be sure to check that out. You can subscribe to that podcast, by the way, on all the audio podcast platforms, and you can also find it on our YouTube channels. And we also stream into LinkedIn as well and Twitter. So be sure to check that out. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a great week. Thanks again, Brad, for being here, and we will see everyone soon.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.